Hi, this is Larry. The topic today is, what is an entity? Well, basically, an entity as it relates to database management systems is the prime element of database design. So what is an entity? Well, basically, an entity represents a person, place, thing, concept, event, idea for which data is stored. Mainly that if you have something that you know about that you can store data about, it can be an entity. As an example, you have employees at a company. Those employees work in departments. So therefore, you know that you probably can have an entity called employee and another one called department within a database. Again, an entity can be anything almost. It can be physical objects such as buildings because you're going to store data about the buildings or any physical objects. It can be about concepts. People can have ideas, or even the order, like you have an order, like you place an order for something, and then even the order lines or the items, individual items, and the lines of the order itself that are there. Those can also be entities. The other thing are events and states, like you have dominoes and these knock down, or the dominoes standing up, or are they knocked down? Now, those are different events, those are different states, events and states that can also become entities. So basically, an entity can represent anything for which data is stored. And entities is a logical definition. Basically, a logical definition, meaning that we understand it logically. We're trying to take something out of nothing and create some kind of logic behind it. So make sure that you remember an entity is a logical definition. It occurs physically as a row in a table in a database management system. So this over here on the left is the entity, and it's the logical definition of that entity. So you have an employee entity and you have these different attributes of it. Over here is what it would look like populated in a database, meaning that you would have the the entity definition is when you create the database table, and then next is every time you go and get an employee, you would then have it populated. So Mary Smith, this information about Mary Smith means it's an entity inside the table. Okay? So when you have all these entities together, a table is not an entity. Please keep this in mind. It often gets confused because you're creating entities and you're creating to physically implement an entity itself is mean you need to create a table in the database. But the table itself is not the entity. The entity is basically the different rows within each one, because you're trying to form the logical definition of what all these different things would actually be. So keep in mind, a table is not an entity. It is an entity set, a collection of entities. So how do you discover entities? Well, basically, identify the nouns and business rules and requirements. If you look at it, look for nouns, and you find different things that will pop out at you, hopefully. And then the next thing to do is examine a list of attributes and group them into categories. You can have a lot of different things that are what you may be attributes and go, well, how can this become an entity from all of this? So let's take a look then at discovering entities, and for yourself, just go ahead and read this for a couple of seconds here and see what kind of entities you can come up with. Do 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 do. Of course, you could probably see by looking at it, even in the first sentence, what is there an entity? One called employee, probably, right? Another one could be called dependent. Another one would be called employee type. And also one would be called department. And another one would be a job skill. Every time you look at trying to identify what entities are, the first thing to do is to try to, at a glance, read through any kind of requirements listing or anything that you have to try to discover what is there that can be an entity. And also, we're going to talk now more about attributes. Understand you can take a collection of attributes and say, hey, these all relate to an employee, like the first line in this example. As you go out now and discover and looking at things to put into a database, always keep thinking, how do I assemble them into entities?